National Center for the Study of Statesmanship, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here this evening. We have an ongoing lecture program. There are flyers out front, and we hope you'll pick those up and be with us for future events. I want to take a moment and thank some special people for coming today, the members of the Richmond Police Department, the Capitol Police of the Commonwealth of Virginia, and the faculty and some students from the VCU's Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs Criminal Justice Program. We appreciate you coming. This is a real pleasure to introduce Gary Noesner. We go back some 40 years. He didn't age, I did. And the one thing that comes to my mind when I think of how long I've known Gary was that the first thing I ever knew about him was that he wanted to be an FBI agent. He said that from the moment he arrived at Florida Southern College, and not only did he fulfill his dream, but he fulfilled it spectacularly. He retired in 2003 after a 30-year career with the FBI. 23 of those as hostage negotiator and 10 of those as the chief hostage negotiator, and has now gone on the book circuit and has his book Stalling for Time out front, which he's going to talk to us about tonight. You're in for a treat. I was able to hear him make a presentation last year at the Festival of the Book at Charlottesville, and I think you will enjoy it and enjoy the opportunity to question and discuss things with him. Gary, welcome to Richmond.
Thanks, Gary. Good evening, everybody, and thanks for coming out. It is a pleasure for me to be here and see Gary again. We go back, as he says, a long way. For those of you here who are students of his, I do have some photographs of him in cut-off jeans and an old sweatshirt that really probably shouldn't be shown publicly, but I will sell one with each copy of my book. My parents gave me to the FBI at a young age. As Gary said, I wanted to become an FBI agent very early, and I'll tell you how that happened. And the younger folks in the audience will laugh, but I was watching the Mickey Mouse Club after school one day. And the young host, as part of this sort of newsreel segment they did, went to the FBI headquarters in Washington and interviewed J. Edgar Hoover, the man himself. And he talked about chasing bank robbers and spies during World War II, and gangsters and all this stuff, and I said, that's it, I've had an epiphany. And I didn't even know what epiphany meant. But I had one, and I said, I want to be one of those. And of course, the end of the show, they went to the indoor firearms range and shot the Thompson machine gun. And I said, oh, this is good stuff. Mom came home, I said, I've just decided what I'm going to do when I grow up. And so she went out and bought me a kid's book about the FBI, and that's all I ever wanted to do. And I was one of those lucky people that was able to fulfill this dream. I got into the FBI, and in my new training, that was 1972, in the dark ages, and when I went to my new agents training, they had some orientation about this new thing that was starting up called hostage negotiations. New York City Police Department, in around that time frame, had several difficult situations. One of them was the famous Attica prison that some of you heard about. And what happened there was so badly managed by the authorities that when they went in to rescue the hostages, I think there were 10 correctional officers who were hostage who were killed, 9 of them by gunshot. Well, the inmates didn't have any guns. In other words, the would-be rescuers ended up killing the hostages who they were trying to save. So people began to think there has to be a better way to resolve these conflicts. There was the Munich massacre. And there was concern that we would have a situation like that. So New York City, and the one some of you may be familiar with was Dog Day Afternoon, the famous movie with Al Pacino, which was a true incident that both the FBI and the New York City Police Department handled a little less as well as they could. So with those things as a motivation, New York came up with this idea, and they came down to the FBI Academy, and they spoke to a real wise agent, and they said, we would like you to look at what we have come up with and see if it's as good as what the FBI does. Now, this agent was very smart because he knew the FBI had no program, but he looked at it and said, it is exactly what the FBI does, word for word. We stole it, lock, stock, and barrel. And shame on us if we wouldn't recognize a good idea. We began to teach around the United States and around the world. Through the years, the intervening years, it has saved countless numbers of individuals. Because when I first got into law enforcement, we would show up to a tense crisis, and we would say, hey, come on out. And the guy would say, no. We'd say, okay, we gave you a chance, and we'd go in. And bad things would happen. We would have to hurt bad guys. Sometimes our guys would get hurt. Sometimes we would, as I mentioned in Attica, hurt hostages. So we came up with this idea, why don't we contain the situation and talk to them and use our verbal skills to resolve the situation peacefully. This, by the way, is a skill set that Congress is unfamiliar with. It's called negotiating, being sincere and genuine. So we began to do that. We had pretty dramatic results. I got involved in it pretty early in my career and ended up working a number of high-profile and interesting cases. I was also working overseas hijackings at the time. Some of you remember the TW-847 hijacking and the Achille Laurel case and a few others that I was involved in early on. One of the first big hostage cases I had, and you say, why are you talking to us about hostage negotiations? The reason is because the skills we use, if they can work in the most desperate of situations, where there's been loss of life and serious injury, emotions are high, and anger is driving behavior, if we can resolve 95+% of those successfully through interpersonal communication skills, then maybe we should be able to do it in more normal human endeavors. See, I believe every human interaction is one of two things. It's either cooperation or it's confrontation. We base anything we do. Driving here tonight to come to lecture, we had to cooperate with other people on the highway. We had to pay attention to the traffic signals and the stoplights. We had to park our car within the lines. There's rules of behavior we all engage in and embrace because we are a society that's dependent. What we have to deal with so often are acting outside of that normal behavior that we're all accustomed to. So we have to find ways to diffuse those situations. I'm going to be honest with you. We don't do it because negotiations is just a nice thing. We want to see everybody be happy and come out of it alive. We do it to save police officers' lives. No matter what happens, we're not God. We didn't create this situation where this man decided to rob a bank and hold hostages. But the one thing we don't want to do is create some widows out of our fellow officers' homes. We want to resolve it. We'll take risks if we have to, but we want to avoid doing unnecessary risks. The old proposition that law enforcement officers, not unlike the military, not unlike other power institutions, really don't like it when people don't do what we say. We say, we want you to surrender, and they say no, and we said, what do you mean no? We are the authorities. How dare you say no? And we want to move to our force card very quickly. In 1996, I flew out to Fort Davis, Texas. There was a militia group called the Republic of Texas that felt that Texas had not been brought into the Union legally after the Civil War. And they decided to kidnap some folks. They had a local altercation. So the Texas Rangers went out and surrounded this property in Fort Davis, Texas. It was a pretty tense standoff. Armed men, very angry, agitated, you have no authority over us, so forth and so on. Well, the Texas Rangers are a much older organization than the FBI. They call us the suits, they call them the hats, for good reason. So I'm out there talking with the hats and helping them, and I talked to a captain. He says, you know, we talked to him yesterday and told him to come out and didn't do it. We're going to go get him today. And I said, well, Captain, I said, can we have a little chat for a minute? Because you don't want to talk to him in front of all the troops. I said, and I gave him what I've come to call, and the FBI now calls the widow speech, which I made up at the scene. And I said, tomorrow when you knock on the door of the widow of one of your officers, and she asks you, did my husband have to lose his life? Did we have to go in and attack those guys who were holding weapons and threatening people? Did we have any other choice? Could we have done anything else? If you can say yes, then go ahead and charge. But if you're concerned about that kind of outcome, I've got some ideas for you. He turned pale as a ghost because he cared about his people. He said, well, what do you have in mind? Well, so let's do some maneuvers. Let's do some interaction with these folks to get them to come to the table in earnest. And we did. And just to finish up that story, we began to let them know that perhaps we weren't going to just sit outside. We moved some vehicles around. We started to come close to their territory, but never on it. And they called in at night and said, well, you guys aren't doing anything tonight, are you? And the negotiator says, we really do need to get this resolved. I know, but you guys aren't going to come in tonight. Well, time really is getting short. So you hear that, you see things on the outside, and next thing you know, they came to the table in earnest the next day and ultimately surrendered. So we use a blend of tactics, and we use a blend of options other than tactics. Now, I want to explain how this works in a lot of ways. What we do are active listening skills. When I was a negotiator, the skill sets we learned were bargaining. You want to come out, I'll give you a hamburger for one of those sausages. You know, it's a simple quid pro quo trade. In fact, there's a famous hijacking happened, not too famous hijacking, in the early 70s in New York City. And there was a young man, he hijacked a plane, he wanted to fly to Europe, and the FBI was talking with him before we had formal negotiations. And the guy says, oh, and next time you come out here, I want a cup of coffee, hot, cream, and 2 sugars. About an hour later, the agent goes out there, hands him a cold cup of coffee, no cream, no sugar. 15 minutes later, the guy surrenders. The agent said, what made you come out? He said, well, I figured if I couldn't get a decent cup of coffee, this other stuff wasn't going to work out. Kind of simplified version of what happened, but we bargained. But what we found out is only 5% of what law enforcement does are really substantive negotiations, quid pro quo bargaining. What 95% of what the police officers who are here do that are negotiators, and what I did, is crisis intervention. When people are emotionally motivated because of life's challenges, there's usually a sense of loss, a loss of a relationship, a loss of a job, a loss of self-esteem. Those are powerful motivators to misbehave and to act out. And when you're doing that, you're acting on emotion, not logic. You're engaged in often self-destructive behavior. Here's a teeter-totter I use in every class I ever taught. You remember this from grammar school, the teeter-totter, one side's up, one side's down. When emotions are high, rationality is low. I defy anyone with all the brains in this room to defy that equation. It is an absolute in human behavior. So what we do as negotiators is we don't come up and say, sir, I've just arrived on the scene and you're really misbehaving, you're acting like a jerk. I have a grand solution to your problem. Not ready for that. We have to earn the right to be suggestive. And what we have to do first is lower emotion before we can begin to create a relationship and exert influence. So when that emotion comes down, look what comes up. The ability to think and act more rationally. That's what this is all about. Now I'm going to tell you a little funny anecdote that really happened on the 4th of July quite some years ago. I'm with my family on the mall in Washington about to watch the fireworks. Now I had friends in the park police that every year helped me park very close to the fireworks. In fact, it got to the point where my entire neighborhood decided they were part of the extended Noesner family and needed to be with us on that special national holiday. So we're down to several dozen people, and I'm sitting down in a chair, baked beans, potato salad, hamburger, and an adult beverage. And my beeper goes off back when we had beepers. And it's a number in South Carolina. I pick up my cell phone, and I call the number. And it's one of my hostage negotiators, a guy named Mike Duke. And he says, I'm on the way to the USS Yorktown, which is a decommissioned U.S. aircraft carrier in Charleston Harbor. And there's a man up there in the conning tower with a high-powered rifle, and he's fired some shots, and he's really upsetting a lot of folks around here. He's having a bad day. Now, based on my food intake and the adult beverage influence on my behavior, I had another epiphany and brilliance. I said, you know, this being the 4th of July, a symbolic day, him being in an aircraft carrier with some solemn symbolism, I'll bet you he's a disgruntled veteran. Ooh, amazing foresight. He's unhappy. Something's bothering him. We have to use some crisis intervention skills. He's not holding hostages. He's not asking for a trade. He's manifesting some of life's troubles. So I said, when you get there, find out additional information, call me back. And then I will share some more brilliant thoughts with you at that time. I go back to what I was doing before, robustly. He calls about an hour. I see the number at 803, and I call the number on my cell phone. And I said, hi, I'm looking for Mike Duke. There's no Mike Duke here. Well, is this the command post? No, it's not. Is this the negotiation room? No. Who'd you say you are? Well, I'm Gary Noesner. I'm the chief negotiator with the FBI. I'm calling from Washington. I guess I'm in more trouble than I thought. That's what we call a clue, ladies and gentlemen. I said, hey, you wouldn't, you wouldn't have to be the guy with the gun, are you? Yes, I am. Well, how you doing? I've had better days. What's your name? Jim. Jim, my name's Gary. You know, I'd like to talk to you about what's going on. Now, I knew I'm not supposed to be negotiating from 400 miles away with a scene that I know nothing about. But Jim and I cranked up a little bit of a conversation. I ended up being the first person that actually made contact with him that day. And I tried to reassure him that even though he hadn't expressed his concern at this point about the police, I tried to reassure him that nobody was there to hurt him. Everybody wanted to help him. They wanted to hear about what was going on and what his issues were, see what we could do to assist him. That's the approach you take. Well, I ended up extricating myself from that call eventually and letting the negotiators at the scene, and they convinced Jim to come out. Jim was a drug addict, an alcohol abuser, but you know what? He served his country. He deserved our time. He deserved the investment of our intervention to try to help him come out of the situation alive, and he did, and it's a success story because we were not overly aggressive. We're not trying to demand what to do. We took our time and worked with him. So that's kind of how the process works. You know, the police mentality, again, is if you ever watched the old show, Dragnet, you know, it's like just the facts, man. That law enforcement voice that we all take, it's authoritative. It can be seen by people that may not be that enamored with us as confrontational. And we have to give them something they don't expect. We have to give them an ear. You know, listening is the cheapest concession you can make. I'll tell you another story. San Antonio, Texas. Young man climbs up a radio tower during Fiesta, the biggest festival every year in San Antonio. Gazillion people in town for the big Fiesta festival, and this guy decides to climb up a radio tower, and he's going to do a swan dive. Well, that's likely to get you some attention, and it did. Dozens and dozens of police cars, lights and sirens, and they're trying to get this guy to come down, and this guy says, no. He's about 100 feet up. They're at the bottom. Come down. No, go to hell. I'm not coming down. Back and forth, back and forth. So after a couple hours, I get a phone call from the chief of police. I'm back at the FBI Academy in Waco, and he says, well, here's what's going on. Do you have any ideas? And I said, well, has he asked for anything? Well, yeah. I said, well, what did he ask for? He wants some cigarettes. I said, well, did you give him cigarettes? He said, well, what are we going to get for it? I don't know, maybe he'll cut off one of his legs and send it down to you. What did you expect to get for it? You know, what you have to do first, remember what I said earlier, we have to establish we're not there to make his day worse. Making a concession along those lines does not hurt us. Old hostage negotiators were trained to never give something unless you get something in return, which is true in a pure bargaining interaction. It is not true in a crisis intervention action. I said, put some cigarettes in a baggie, put some matches, don't diddle with him. Tell him you're going to come up halfway, you got to explain exactly what you got to do. Crisis is no time for surprise. We're going to come halfway up, we're going to leave the cigarettes, and we're going to come back down, then you can come down and get the cigarettes, and there you go. Now, two things are accomplished. We demonstrate we're there to help him and not hurt him. He comes down where we can talk to him in a more normal voice, we don't have to shout and scream. Now, before they implement that, and they agreed to do that, I said, there's two other things you need to do. I said, what is that? I said, send most of the police cars home. Turn off the lights, turn off the sirens, stop the show, send over everybody home you can. Okay, what else? Send somebody to McDonald's. McDonald's, yes. Get yourself lunch, come back, and the few officers who remain sit under the tower and eat your lunch, and don't pay him any attention while you're eating your lunch. Well, apparently the gentleman forgot to bring lunch to work today, and he was hungry. So from this tower, he looks down, he says, what are you guys doing down there? We're just eating lunch, we'll get back in a little bit. Hey, those are my fries. I don't know, who had the chocolate shake? Did you ever want the chocolate shake? He surrenders about 15 minutes later. Party's over. The undivided attention, the escalation. You know, in law enforcement, we have to respond to these situations. We don't have a choice. But can you see, or can you not see how, when we show up, sometimes our mere response is escalating? Not everybody inside a crisis site says, oh, goody, the police are here to help. It's tougher than that. It's tougher than that. We have to show, not only through our actions, but our behavior and our statements, that we're trying to resolve this peacefully. We're trying to be reasonable. There are times where a perpetrator, as they say in New York, perpetrator, or a subject's actions force us to use force. But in most cases, we can really control an outcome or influence an outcome by how we behave. What you first have to do, and this is where it has application in life in general, we have to earn the right to be of influence. We do that by listening, paraphrasing what we've just heard, asking open-ended questions. Could you tell me more about that? That sounds very interesting. And by the way, guys, if I knew these things when I was in college, my dating would have been a lot more successful. Because instead of going to the bar and said to the young lady, sure, pretty good guy at campus, you can probably see me on the side, president of this and president of that, you know. Let me spend the next hour talking about me, because I know you're going to love it. Well, that didn't seem to work as well, but if you sit down with her, you say, well, tell me about yourself. What do? You have any hobbies? Yeah, I like to sew. And you say, must be fascinating. What are you sewing? What kind of stuff do you make? Well, really not that good. No, I find this interesting because I don't know anything about it. Would you tell me more? You got a date that night. Okay? Nobody teaches us guys this. I think we're going to go around campuses and teach this to guys, you know? It'd be a lot smarter. But, you know, if you take the time to try to learn about somebody else and what's going on with them, it is a powerful tool to influence. It is a powerful tool. People want to work with, cooperate with people that they like and who they find are genuine. Have you been to a social function, a gathering, a cocktail party for the adults, whatever it might be, a college meeting, and you run across somebody and you have one of those conversations, and you find you have some common interest, and you say, well, gee, I'd like to get to know that person better because they sounded very interesting and they're very likable. That's how friendships are made. But we can all extend that natural draw we have to somebody who's similar by taking the time and listening and finding out about people that maybe on the surface we're not that similar with. So those are some of the things that we talked about. So we had some success with this, a great deal of success in diffusing situations. The tough problem became in law enforcement, and to some extent exists today, is not dealing with folks in crisis, but dealing with command. In any organization, bosses sometimes don't understand what we're doing. There was a case once where this guy had committed murder in another state, and the FBI found him in a house, and one of our negotiators was talking to him and getting nowhere. He just didn't want to surrender. Like a lot of guys, he didn't want to go back to jail, he didn't want to surrender, so his decision is no decision. I'm not going to do anything. For every one of those, I've had a police official say, that guy knows exactly what he's doing. He's manipulating us. Well, maybe. But chances are, in my view, he just has no idea to get out of what he got into. Don't want to die, don't want to go to jail. So the negotiators talk to him. So the negotiator finally says to him, you know, he happened to be a carpenter, this particular fugitive, and said, I understand that you are a skilled carpenter. And the guy said, yeah. He said, well, forget this stuff going on here. Can I ask you a question? What do you want to know? I want to build a shed in my backyard. And I want to keep my gardening tools in there, my lawnmower and some stuff like that. Well, how big a shed? Well, I don't know. I got to put this in it and that. Well, you need about this size and that size. What kind of materials do you want to use? I don't know. What do you suggest? They talked for 2 hours about building this shed. The on-scene commander's walking around like this going, I cannot believe this. I got 100 guys here, and this idiot negotiator's in there talking about building a shed with this guy. How are we ever going to get him to surrender? Well, what was going on? This highly educated FBI agent was saying to this guy who was somewhat less educated, somewhat less successful in life, you have a skill, you have something that I respect. You have some knowledge, some experience that I'm interested in. So after they talked about the shed, the guy says, you know, I'm ready to come out now. Well, that's good. That's great. Let's have you do that. Just leave your gun aside, come on out with your hands up. And the guy said, okay, I'll do that. And he said, but by the way, you want me to help you build that shed when I come out? The agent said, you think I'm telling you my address? No. That part did not happen, actually. But so far as I know, the shed was not built by that guy. But you see what happened there. You see the influence and the ability. And this has application, I believe, in everyday life. It has application to dealing with our families, our coworkers, people we meet in all life situations. I wasn't always such a good listener. Back in the mid-'80s, I told you I was traveling overseas quite a bit on hijackings. And I was war-weary, and I'd come home, and I'd have a few weeks at home, and I'd sit down, and I would pick up the greatest invention ever made by mankind, the TV remote changer. And in Fairfax, Virginia, where I lived, I had control of about 200 cable stations. Awesome power for a man to hold in his hands. I could scroll through all those stations in a matter of minutes, and unless I saw a car chase, an explosion, or a sporting event, I did not stop. I did not buy a lot of jewelry on the home shopping network, if you follow my drift. Well, I'm in there drinking a beer, changing channels rapidly, and then I feel a presence behind me. Not unlike the Buffalo Soldiers when the Apaches were sneaking up on them, they kind of knew. And it was herself. And she was back there. And I sensed her presence, but being a man, I paid no attention to it. And then she communicated in a distinctive feminine way. She goes, which every woman here understands, no men do. It means, my beloved husband, I'd like to converse with you for a few minutes. Not understanding it, I too ignored it. I'm changing my channels. Then she goes, ladies know this is an escalation. This is a more serious effort to engage in communication with her husband. To show my nurture and support and attentiveness, I actually move my head partly from the TV, about a 45, and I go, which ladies don't understand, but men do, means, yes, my beloved spouse, I'm here for you. Well, then she says something that changes the course of the conversation. She says, I can't believe he did it. Well, you just can't drop that one and let it go. It requires a response. So I said, now turning halfway from the TV, what? Which is nurturing in itself. She says, I can't believe my boss made me work late again Friday night. So third Friday night, now, my wife is fortunate. She's married to a brilliant guy. I mean, I'm able to do what most law enforcement officers, I identify a problem, I solve the problem, and I move on to another problem. I perceptively dissect her issue and her problem. I take both eyes off the TV set, I look her almost square in the eyes, and say, you tell him you're not working late on Fridays anymore. I mean, it's brilliant. It's brilliant. I did all those things. Problem solved, move on. You know. Somehow this did not satisfy her needs. Surprisingly. So she gets on the phone, and she walks away. I do ask her for another beer from the refrigerator, and she didn't comply with that either. She gets on the phone, calls her best friend, and spends the next 2 hours on the phone with her. And the friend is saying things like, oh, it must have made you feel so bad. I had a boss like that. What did you think when he said that? You know, they just had the grandest old time talking, and her friend didn't ever come close to solving the problem like I did. She just talked to her, and listened. Imagine that stuff. Well, guys, of course that never really happened. I would never be so cold and independent. And I'm not going to suggest in front of this group that we get in touch with our feminine side. Women tend to be a little bit more empathic and a little bit better listeners than we guys are. But we have to work at that. In any relationship in life, you know, if you want to be successful, I don't know a single field or endeavor where listening isn't the approach. Now, I mentioned I worked a number of prison rides and situations. I worked a number of hijackings. I worked 122 kidnappings involving American citizens overseas. So I was on the road quite a bit. My wife did a great job raising my children. And I, to this day, introduce my wife of 37 years as my first wife. There's a communication issue there, I think, because she always responds by saying, and this is my current husband. But I keep telling her, well, it is true, you are my first wife. She said, that's not the point. So we just joked on that issue. Let me talk to you a little bit about Waco, and I'll answer some questions about that later on. The FBI program really, I think, was instrumental in helping influence the larger law enforcement audience. Part of our mission was to help police do a better job at what they do. That was part of what Congress funds the FBI for. I think that's less critical today, obviously, than it was back when I was younger in this business. But we provided materials and training and scenarios, and we traveled around the country and had police officers from all over the country back in the United States. We learned what went right in these situations, what went wrong, how can we improve upon the skills to achieve better outcomes. And with that, we had a real sea change in the business. But then we had a couple major situations, and the biggest one that the FBI confronted was Waco. And I'll be very candid, I'm one of the leading FBI's critics on Waco. What we had at Waco was a sort of a hybrid situation. You're all pretty familiar with David Koresh. This is 1993, February 28th. Agents from the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Agency attempt to serve arrest warrants on David Koresh and a search warrant on the Davidian compound, a religious sect. And when they're preparing this raid, they want coverage. They want news coverage of it because they're having some budgetary issues. So they tell the news media, come out and cover our raid of the Davidian compound. So the news media truck says, we gotta get there early, we gotta get good camera position so we can see this interesting thing going on. And they're lost on the rural highway. And the mailman stops and says, can I help you guys? You look like you're lost. Yeah, we're looking for the Branch Davidian compound. We want to cover the ATF raid. The mailman was David Koresh's father-in-law. He drives back to the compound and says, they're coming. So when ATF pulls up in front and the agents get out of these cattle cars that they used as a disguise to approach the compound, a huge firefight took place. Thousands and thousands of ammunition rounds were fired. 4 ATF agents were killed, 17 wounded, 4 or 5 Davidians were killed in the shootout. The ceasefire was obtained. They were able to recover the wounded and the dead, and there was a bit of a stalemate. Koresh himself was wounded in the shootout. So now the FBI comes out, and because federal agents had been killed, even though from another agency, the FBI was now in charge of resolving the situation. And I am both a critic of the ending, but also I've never been more proud of how my negotiation team got out all 35 people that came out. Very proud of that under the most challenging of circumstances. And we did it in some unique ways. We were faced with a group whose only demand, anybody can guess? What do you think their demand was?
Leave us alone.
Bingo, leave us alone, go away. We're not part of your country, we're not part of your authority, we live independent, go away. That's the one thing we couldn't do. We didn't have the power to leave them alone. So how then do you convince people to do what you want when you have no leverage? When they don't want to trade for something, when they don't need money, they don't need transportation. There's nothing you can give them that they don't have. They live a Spartan lifestyle. You know, they very sustain themselves off the land. They had very little commerce with the outside community. So we basically had to sweet talk them out. We had to say, listen, we're not the group that came in here before, and we told the ATF we were using this approach. We're here to get this resolved, have your day at court, treat you with respect and dignity, to try to get this resolved. Koresh started releasing children. He did not release children that he had fathered, of which there were many, but he released some of the other children. We came to learn that the reason he did this, at least we think, was that he wanted to ensure the loyalty of the parents who would now remain inside and be more willing to die for his cause now that their children were taken care of. So the children came out with little signs saying, I'm supposed to be sent to my Aunt Sophie in Des Moines or my Uncle Charlie in California, whatever it might be. Well, we didn't send them there. The kids would come out, we'd pick them up, we'd bring them to the negotiation room where my team, we'd put them on our laps and we'd call back inside. And we'd talk to David Koresh and we'd say, David, we picked up Susie. Can we talk to her mom? She wants to talk to her mom. Now you have to understand, we didn't know who was inside at the beginning of this. And we thought Koresh was telling them all very bad things about us. And of course, what happened the day before, the days before, pretty much reinforced his apocalyptic philosophy. They're coming to get us. So we get these kids, we get them on the phone, we say we have Susie here, but before I put Susie on the phone with you, I want you to know that here, everybody here in the FBI wants to get you out of there alive and safe. We're concerned about you, so forth and so on. So it gave us a chance to introduce ourselves, to identify them, and then to put their child on the phone. Pretty smart, I thought. Some of those moms would later come out and join their children. It was our theory to try to break this hypnotic religious stranglehold that David Koresh had over them, to get them to come out and resume their parental responsibilities. We had, over 21 of those children survived through that method, 35 people in all. But what would happen, we did a couple very novel things that I'm proud of. After a while, all these children were kept in a child protective home, a very warm and nurturing environment. And one of my team members, I wish it had been, he had the idea, let's take a video camera in there and videotape the kids in this very nice environment, send it back into the parents. We did, and it had a powerful influence because they could see how happy the kids were, how well they were being taken care of, and it was a reminder that they, the parents, needed to come out and resumed the control. One of the things we didn't notice, though, there was one little boy in there, looked a little forlorn. There was a lady named Katherine Schroeder, whose husband was killed, her second husband was killed in the shootout with the ATF. She had two older boys from a prior husband and this little boy, Brian. Well, her husband had joint custody, her first husband. He came, and he was the only person who was able to take two kids away. We had no legal way to keep the kids. So little Brian is now by himself. And we didn't even notice this on the video. He looks a little forlorn. So she gets on the phone one day after seeing this tape and really unloads on us, berates us. He needs to be with his brothers. You shouldn't have separated them. You shouldn't have split them up. And she's really railing and railing against us. And one of the best FBI negotiators we've ever had, a guy named John Dolan, no longer with us, is on the phone with her. And I had another epiphany. I wrote on a 3x5 card as the team leader, and I handed him his card. He looks up at me with a big smile. And he reads the card. And moms, put yourself in Kathy Schroeder's seat when he reads this message. You know, Kathy, little Brian needs a hug from his mommy right now. That's not fair, is it? That's heavy stuff. You could hear her choke on the phone call. She couldn't even talk for a few minutes. And then John just took it from there about her responsibility, how much he needed her. She was ultimately the first adult that came out on her own volition, without permission from David Koresh, and was able to tell us a wealth of information about what was going on inside, what they were planning, what they were believing, things that we didn't know. Well, we continued to have some successes, but while we were doing this as a negotiation team, tremendous public scrutiny. This was all over the news, all over the world. A lot of pressure on the government to do something. Some of the FBI said, we look powerless, we look weak. We're letting this goofball control us. In the old days, we'd just go in and arrest them and get them. Yeah, but there's women and children in there. So it was mounting pressure. It was costing $1 million a day, a huge sum of money. How long is this going to take? How much time do we have to invest in this? So while the on-scene commander would say, Gary, your negotiation team, keep at it, he would also go out to the tactical commander and say, what do you want to do? He said, well, we're going to go forward. We're going to crush the cars. We're going to be more aggressive. The tactical commander felt, you get people to do what you want by putting ever-increasing pressure on them. Anybody see the risk of that? Are you going to believe what you see or what you hear? Negotiators are doing a good job, but when they look out the window, they get a different impression about the intent of the government. Some of you may remember Waco, that loud music was played. That was over the objections of the negotiation team. The FBI doesn't train that, never did, never had before, and it was done without our guidance. So there was obviously pressure on people to do more and more in the FBI. I was eventually replaced as the chief negotiator halfway through Waco. Nobody else came out. All 35 people came out. That was the last ones. They brought in somebody else and they took a harder stance. Koresh eventually shut down communications and the FBI put in the tear gas. Some of you may believe the FBI burned the building down. That's not true. The Davidians did start the fire. However, you could certainly say that they were responding and reacting very strongly to what we did. There were actually people in the FBI that said, when we put this tear gas in here, these moms will say, oh, this is uncomfortable. Let me take my child and run out to the nice man in the tank. And if you convince yourself of that, that's what happens. 3 years later, we had another situation in Montana. Freeman, another anti-government group. And this time, the director of the FBI calls me during the incident when the top commanders are sitting there with me, and he says, Gary, your director wants you to know that we are in no rush to end this. This is going to be done the right way. We've got the FBI back to where we were before, being smart, being creative, and we resolved that situation without a shot of fire. Let me give you one example of another one that's pretty bad, and then I'm going to have some time for your questions. Some years ago in Edison, New Jersey, there was a young man that met a young girl in community college, and he liked her a whole bunch, and she didn't like him very much at all. But he kept pursuing her, and started following her home, went to her home, and in the driveway, gets in a big argument with her. She says, get out of my life, quit following me. He says, oh, but I love you, we're meant for each other, whatever. Her mom comes out and starts to really get angry and belligerent with this guy. He pulls out a gun and kills the mom. This is what we call an escalation. He then shoots the girl 5 times, but doesn't kill her. Now he's barricaded in the home with the only other person inside the home, the 5-year-old brother of the girl who shot. Police show up, surround the house, open up negotiations. Now, do you think that fellow planned for this confrontation to happen that day? No. He planned to try to get her to let him into her life, but he didn't plan. He acted on rage and emotion. He didn't go today and say, I'm going to shoot the mom and shoot her and hold myself barricaded against the police. So it's moment for moment with no clear plan and certainly no exit strategy. Well, after several hours of him not communicating back, the police decide to use some innovative equipment, which are called big rocks. And they throw the rocks in the window, because this is supposed to, get him to start talking with us. Now, there's a thing we call in law enforcement the action imperative. Police don't like to be in a position where we are seen to do nothing. We have to do something to be seen as being active. Dr. Harvey Schlossberg used to call this dynamic activity, because when negotiators would be talking to somebody and sometimes just waiting for things to happen, the on-scene commanders would say, it's almost like you're not doing anything. And they'd say, no, we're engaged in dynamic activity. Oh, okay, very good. Carry on. We have a strategy. We're being proactive. Sometimes we just have to wait and let emotions cool down. Well, they tried the rocks didn't work. And somebody comes up with a brilliant idea. They're going to get an armored personnel carrier and drive it at the plate glass window of the house at full speed. And they're going to stop about 5 feet from the house, and they're going to back away, and they're going to scare this guy. Now, I want you to be part of this conversation. I'm going to use you, sir, as a prop. You're the father of the girl who's in the hospital fighting for her life. Your wife is dead. Your 5-year-old boy's life is in bounds. I'm the chief of police. Now, listen, sir. We've been trying to talk to this mope for hours. He's just not talking to us. I got an idea. And we tried that rock stuff. We're going to see if we can scare you know what out of him and see what happens. You like the idea? Well, I call that poking the snake. This man had made no threats against the child, didn't even recognize that he was there, but he certainly didn't say, I'm going to kill the kid. Now, if there is a rattlesnake coiled up in the corner here, I would recommend that probably the very last thing any of us do is get a stick and poke it and see what happens. There are a number of things that can happen. None of them are good. Yet that's what we do sometimes. We have this compelling need to be seen as doing something, as controlling a situation. You know what? It worked. They did the armored personnel carrier, scared the hell out of the guy, picked up the phone and surrendered. And they got on the TV afterwards. I'll do my best New Jersey accent. Said, well, we told that guy we weren't taking no more crap from him. And we made business. And we were coming in. And he surrendered. So success is success. It works. Okay? North Carolina, some years ago, a chief of police was killed walking up in front of a bank situation with a hostage. Says, I want to talk to you. The guy shoots and kills the chief. His beleaguered widow gets on the news that night and says, I know what he was doing. He'd done it 5 times before. He talked people out. It was stupid those 5 times before. But we can do a lot of things that are stupid, don't make sense, aren't good procedures, and get away with it. But we've learned to avoid those things. So those are some of the challenges that even today we face in law enforcement. You know, we serve our communities, whether at the federal level, the local level, the state level, it doesn't matter. We serve our communities. Citizens want to see law enforcement as well-trained, competent, and following this guiding principle. We use force not because we can, but because the actions and behaviors of a perpetrator or subject leave us no choice. I always tell people, the guy with the gun decides the outcome. They can be reasonable or they can be unreasonable. It's our job to help them become reasonable. So, in my book, may I use yours as a prop for a second? Which came out just a year ago. I was fortunate Random House asked me to do this, and it kind of talks about the evolution of the negotiation profession, talks about a lot of the cases, a few of which I've mentioned, and why I think it's so important that today's leaders, not only in law enforcement, but in politics, in the military, understand some of these principles. Teddy Roosevelt said it better than others. Walk softly to carry a big stick. do everything we can to avoid conflict. If we have to engage in conflict, we certainly want to be prepared to do it. But that should be the course of last resort. That's our last alternative. Again, we don't use force because we can. We use force because we're left with no choice. I think that's defensible. I think that's what people want to see, particularly in their law enforcement agencies, which come to an even higher standard or a more restrictive standard than even our military does. So those are just some of the things I talked about. I do wish everybody in Congress would read the book and maybe they get along and play in the sandbox a bit better. I don't think that's going to happen. In the time that we have left, 10 or 15 minutes here, I'd be very pleased to answer any questions you have and ask me anything I'm not shy about. Yes, sir.
Have you had any experience with someone who wants to die because of some higher calling? And they want to explode their bomb and kill themselves. They want to, and also people close by.
Yeah, the gentleman asked, for those who couldn't hear, if I had experience with people who actually want to kill themselves. You know, I was one of the early agents working Middle East terrorism back in the day when nobody in the FBI knew the difference between a Shia and a Sunni. You know, and back then, the terrorists, the PLO, was political. It wasn't a religious movement. It didn't have that same level of fanaticism. And we were able to convince hijackers to surrender, not hurt the hostages. They wanted to live more than they wanted to die, despite what they said. That dynamic has changed. I was still in the FBI on September 11th, and if I had gotten a phone call at my desk from one of the people on that plane in Pennsylvania, I would have said, stay in your seat, the plane's going to land, if I had not known about the towers, by the way. I would have said, stay in your seat, the plane's going to land, and we're going to negotiate it out. And that would have been good advice, and of course it would have been bad advice, wouldn't it? Because the dynamic changed. I don't know if there's any foolproof method to convince somebody that's dead set on killing themselves and harming others for a political reason. I know one of my dearest friends, I've been to Israel several times, he was the chief negotiator of Israel, and he said they've arrested a certain number of bombers, suicide bombers, and there are clearly more that will kill themselves, but every once in a while there's a guy that seems to have a malfunction, he has a little change of heart and decides not to kill himself. So I think there's always a chance to try to convince people to turn away from violence. So, but those are the most challenging cases we face, there's no question about it. Yes, sir.
I was wondering, maybe as a continuation of that question, it seems that a lot of the focus on negotiating has been on what supporters call enhanced interrogation techniques.
Yes.
Critics call torture, and a lot of the supporters say, there's some information that people won't give up without these techniques like waterboarding, sleep deprivation, long time in isolation. And the supporters say, or the critics say, even though, yes, we have concerns about civil liberties, but actually the hardcore, the experienced negotiators decide with us that you kind of get more flies by talking and listening and being patient than you do by enhanced interrogation. What's your opinion?
Well, I can't repeat the question if you didn't hear, but it's basically about waterboarding. And I will be very blunt, I'm totally against it. I think it, and the main reason I'm against it, it doesn't work. If you want to read a very good book, my good friend Peter Bergen has written a book, America at War, where he talks about this. And despite some of the political claims, nothing was prevented based on those techniques. In fact, there's an FBI agent named Ali Safwan, who I did not know. He's much younger than me in the business. But he was actually getting really quality information. He was shunned aside. Contractors went in, they went hard on these guys, and they got nothing from it. In the book, I talk about one of the early cases. In 1985, I flew to Italy to work the Achille Lauro hijacking, which may be before your time, but it was a pretty famous case for those of us of another generation. And I had a chance to interrogate the 4 Achille Lauro terrorists. The Italians had already had 6 or 7 opportunities at them, and they got nothing. The approach I took with my very talented interpreter was a much different approach. Complimenting the guy we thought was the leader on how he had organized it, and said, boy, that was fascinating how you controlled the ship. There was only 4 of you. He ended up giving us a full confession of the murder of Leon Klinghoffer, a wheelchair-bound American who was killed on the ship. To me, that was the first real experience. And the guy that gave me that confession, I sat across from him at the table, And at the first 15 minutes of the conversation, I was expecting him to come across the table and try to kill me. I've never seen so much hate and fanaticism in my life, yet we turned him around. And it was a stark reminder to me that that will not always be successful and sometimes takes time. My experience is when you put coercive techniques on people, they just simply tell you what you want to hear, and it's unreliable. And I have some inside information on that, and I can verify, at least I'm confident in my own mind, that they got nothing worthwhile from that. So I know some of the people were involved in it. So that's my opinion. Yes, Miss?
It seems that a lot, like, a big part of crisis situations is remaining calm and then taking action. Would you say that that's an inborn characteristic in people, or would you say that it can be learned? And if it can be learned, what kind of advice would you give to remain calm and then logically and rationally come to a conclusion?
Yeah, I'm not even going to try to restate it because you said it so well, but you're absolutely right. I think one of the primary attributes for a successful negotiator is self-control. I quote, at the beginning of one of the chapters of my book with a quote from Rudyard Kipling, which I think says it better than anything. If you can keep your head about you when others are losing theirs. You know, the ability to stay calm in a tense situation and use your skills and your deductive reasoning to come up with better decisions is a tremendous skill to have. Some people do it very naturally, to answer the second part of your question. Others of us have to work at it. You know, I think I had some natural inclinations there, but like everyone else, I learned as I went along. And it's quite easy to get angry. I mean, when you're dealing with a guy, we mentioned him already, so I'll mention him again, David Koresh. I mean, he was a lying, manipulative guy. I mean, he was a challenge to speak with. And it took a lot of fortitude to keep from getting, very angry at him. But I think that's a key point, not only for the negotiator, or the negotiation team rather, it is a team sport, that's talking with the perpetrator, but also for command. In Waco, our on-scene commander got angry. When Koresh would say he was going to do something and not do something, it really didn't surprise us as negotiators. We're kind of used to people saying one thing and doing something else, changing their mind, trying to manipulate us. We don't overreact to it. The on-scene commander went ballistic, and that would cause him to do things that then ratcheted up the entire interaction. So, very good question. I think you're a natural negotiator. Anything else? Yes, sir.
Can you give us other examples of how media is impacting hostage negotiation these days?
Less so, but in the early days of the business, say, back in the late 70s and 80s, the news media would often call into a crisis site and, talk to the perpetrators and say, are you going to kill the hostages? Are you going to kill yourself? And, all kinds of, they became part of the story instead of covering the story. I helped the Radio and Television News Directors Association write some guidelines that should guide the industry not to do that. You still see it come up occasionally. I'll give you a very dramatic example. I hate to keep talking about Waco, but in the first couple hours of Waco, an FBI agent, police officers at that time negotiating with David Koresh, and the operator gets on the phone and says, I have a collect call from A Current Affair, a TV show, for Mr. David Koresh. Will you take the call? The police says, this is a law enforcement officer, we have an emergency situation, operator, get off the line, you're not going to make a connection. She connects A Current Affair. On the show, David Koresh gives his last will and testament. Do we want a guy to do that? No. Do we want them to talk to their mother and say, I want to say my farewell to you? No, that's why we don't do those things. So the news media is a lot better. There are some events, and this gentleman mentioned it when he's talking about in the realm of terrorism. We know, take the Mumbai situation, that to a large extent the actions of those terrorists was driven towards holding those hotels for a couple days and driving news media coverage. So it is something that we have to live with. Like some police officers, I don't inherently think the media is evil or bad. I've used them to good effect many times where I say to someone, if you let people go and come out, I will ensure you have a chance to be interviewed by the media. And I honor that agreement. So it's a reward for good behavior. It's not giving it to them up front. Yes, sir.
Why did they take you off the case in Waco, the David Koresh case?
Because I was resisting the more aggressive efforts, and I'm guilty of that charge. There's no question about it. I actually was. So I was sent overseas immediately after that because I had something else going on, and I was supposed to come back to Waco. I came back the day before, and they said, you're not going back to Waco, we're putting in tear gas tomorrow. I was at FBI headquarters, the tear gas went in, the fire started, I got up and left, never asked permission to leave. I was furious. The next day I flew to Lucasville for a prison ride. I didn't see a lot of my family for a while there, so why I'm still married to Mrs. Noesner is quite an amazing story in and of itself. That's another book. But yeah, they did, and I'm not ashamed of that. I'm actually proud of it. In the FBI, there are three people who command the situation. There's the on-scene commander, the ultimate decision maker. There's the tactical leader and the negotiation leader. Two of those three people were forced to retire. The third person got a promotion. Really good-looking guy. So there was a recognition in the FBI that the negotiators had it right. In fact, the congressional hearings, the reports done, everything showed that the negotiation approach was working and it should not have been abandoned. Yes, sir.
What has been the biggest change in negotiation techniques since when you started and since when you left?
Well, it is that a recognition that what police were really doing were more emotionally driven situations than bargaining. And most departments still use the term hostage negotiations. A hostage in the dictionary is a very specific thing. Someone being held for the fulfillment of a substantive demand against another. So it's a very quid pro quo. You do this for me and I do that for you. People hold hostages to get something done that they have no other way of getting done on their own. You know, money, transportation, political change, whatever it might be. But what we found out is even though we were training cops and FBI agents to bargain, they were really engaged in situations that was crisis intervention. So learning those skills, dealing with suicide. Every police negotiator, if he does this long enough, suicide will be the number one thing you will face, and if you do it long enough, somebody will kill themselves, despite whatever you did. I taught a school in Anchorage, Alaska once, for the entire state, every police officer in the state, I think, was a negotiator. And at the end of a day where I talked about active listening skill, all the beepers in this front row go off. And it's all Alaska State troopers, and they all get up and run out. They come in the next morning and they walk out a big smile on their face. I said, is there a story here to share? Oh yeah, oh yeah. What happened yesterday? I said, we got called out about 20 miles outside town to a rural home, and there was a 45-year-old woman whose husband had left her, her kids lived out of state, she had no support mechanism, and she stood on the front porch with a gun to her head, and she was going to put a bullet in her brain. And we did that, and he looks at the other guy and says, active listening. We did that stuff, and you know what? That's good stuff, it works. And they felt so good because you know what? This wasn't some nasty criminal. This wasn't one of society's losers. This was a nice lady, your mother, your sister, your aunt, who was going through a really tough time. And they saved her life. They saved her life, and they felt rightfully really good about it. And I will tell you as a negotiator, there's no high greater than when that happens, and on the other side of the equation, there's probably nothing that traumatizes you worse than to lose somebody. You know, if a bank robber kills a hostage, we all blame the bank robber. But if some young person jumps off the bridge that you've been trying to talk to, you blame yourself. What should I have said? What could I have said? Those are the toughest on police officers. So, good question. Anything else? Well, I want to thank you all for coming out tonight. I hope, I know Gary wants to say something. I hope you found some nuggets in what I had to say based on what I've learned in crisis situations that may have some applicability in relationships in everyday life. I believe it does. I think it's made me a better person. My wife, however, would be up here and she would say, you teach listening skills? But I try. It's a constant struggle at home. And I always just say, this stuff never works at home. In fact, I'd come home sometimes and said, she'd be angry. I said, well, honey, you sound very upset. She don't go, no. Don't you even start that here. No, I'm not in charge at home. No. Thank you all very much.
I was thinking earlier what courage it takes to do a job like that for 30 years. But then it occurred to me it took even more courage to come here and let me introduce him tonight. And I would like to spend the next hour telling you the stories of how far he's come. It's really just an extraordinary trip. Thank you all for being with us. We have a reception and a book signing outside down the hallway. Our next event will be November 4th, and that will be Gary Gallagher of the University of Virginia, who will be speaking on presidents and generals, command relationships during the Civil War. Thanks again for being with us.